Good evening. It's wonderful to see so many of you here tonight. So my name is Martin Buzzer. I'm the senior lecturer in physics and astrophysics at the University of Hull, and it's my great pleasure to be the chair for tonight's lecture, Can Science Explain Everything? So on behalf of the University of Hull, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's event. So tonight's lecture is in fact part of an annual series of lectures called the Hull Lectures, which have been organized by an informal group of Christian academics at the university to promote the university as a forum where the big questions of life can be discussed in a constructive and open manner. And we've been very, very privileged over the last few years to have a number of very distinguished speakers giving different talks on different topics. So for the 2020 Hull Lecture, we are delighted to have Professor Ard Louis with us to help us explore the fascinating and much debated topic of the relationship between science and faith. So Ard is Professor of Theoretical Physics at Oxford University, where he leads an interdisciplinary team studying problems that are at the a boundary between physics, chemistry, and biology. He has also spoken and written widely on the relationship between science and faith, and is therefore eminently qualified to speak on tonight's topic. So the plan for tonight is that Ard will speak for around 40 minutes or so. We will then have a Q&A session lasting around 40 minutes with the aim of finishing by 9 p.m. But just before Ard comes to speak to us, I'd like to just invite him up to join me so that I can ask him a few questions so that we can get to know him a little bit better before he talks. So please, can we give Ard a warm welcome? Great to see you here, Ard. So Ard, you were a postdoc in Cambridge. You're now a professor of theoretical physics at Oxford, and now you're here in Hull. So how does it feel to finally have been to all three of the three great universities in the UK?
Well, it's a great honor to be here.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm very pleased to be here. Yeah.
There you are. This is crowning glory, I am sure, so of your career. So, great. More seriously, so you're obviously passionate about science. Can you tell us how you got into science in the first place?
Well, I've always been interested in science from as long as I remember. As a child, I was interested in how things worked. My parents are both biologists, and apparently, I don't remember this, but as a child, in my teenage years, I once sat them down and said, "Mom and Dad, I have something to say that you're going to be unhappy about." And you can imagine a teenager says this, "You worry." And I said to them, "I'm not going to be a biologist, I'm going to be a physicist."
So broken their hearts.
Broken their hearts.
Yeah.
I've moved back to biology now, and so apparently
So you've made amends.
made amends, yeah. But they like to rib me about this.
Great. Now, I know that you have a lot of other interests besides science, so one of them being filming. So, for example, you made a 4-part documentary on science and faith with your atheist friend, David Malone, and you even appeared on TV with Morgan Freeman. Ooh, okay. So, could you tell us a little bit more about these things?
Yeah, so the documentary series called Why Are We Here? You can still see it on various streaming things with David Malone, who's, I think, one of the best science filmmakers, if not the best science filmmaker in the UK. So it was a great privilege to travel around. And basically, we got paid to go ask interesting people questions. And it was pretty amazing. So we saw all kinds of fascinating things. That was really fun. And with Morgan Freeman, it was just a day. It's a film series called The Story of God. You can still see it. It's on Netflix at the moment. If you go on Netflix, look for Proof of God, and you'll find me and Morgan Freeman. Okay. And so I've never actually met any other celebrities except Morgan Freeman, and you kind of, where do you go from there? Okay. So I think that's it. But I enjoyed it tremendously. I had one day of being a movie star. So I walked out in the street in New York City. People everywhere were crowding around. They had bodyguards as we walked towards the black limousines, and everybody was looking. Morgan Freeman, who's that guy?
Wow, brilliant.
That was it. And that's probably. I think it's probably the end of my filming career, my movie career. But it was good. It was good while it lasted.
Brilliant. I just had one last question. So I noticed on your Wikipedia page that you are interested in molecular gastronomy. For the benefit of the uninitiated, could you tell us briefly what that is?
Well, so I'm primarily interested in eating, but molecular gastronomy is applying science to food. And so it's, you're always doing science to food. When you boil something, it's science to food. But you can think of more complicated ways of doing so. And so you might use different textures or things you wouldn't normally think about. So I'll give you one example. When you go home, try some dark chocolate and a light blue cheese like gorgonzola. You might think this tastes disgusting, but they actually have overlaying ketone spectra. And they're flavor compounds, and in Western cuisine, we like to overlap our flavor compounds. It'll taste remarkably well. And that's a piece of something was discovered by looking at the spectra. So it's a piece of molecular gastronomy. Okay. So if you forget anything, you don't remember anything from today, go home, try it. Yeah, at least half of you will like it.
Okay. Brilliant.
My
Great.
prediction.
So you heard it here first, okay? So, great. Well, many thanks, Ard. So without further ado, let me hand over to you to deliver the 2020 Hull Lecture, Can Science Explain Everything? Thank you very much.
So thank you very much to all of you showing up on a rainy evening here in Hull. I had a beautiful train ride up, especially at the end. We got close to Hull with the river and the water. It's really a beautiful part of the world. Can you hear me in the back? No? I'll move it a little bit, get it a bit louder. So the topic of today is, can science explain everything? And I probably wouldn't be here if I thought the answer to that was yes. And so my aim today is to help you at least not necessarily answer that question definitively, but hopefully help you to ask questions about it in a better way. And first, I want to talk a little bit about science. And one thing that people may not realize is that science is often done in groups. So this is my research group. The Louis Research Group is a picture I have on my website, partially to make students think if they join my group that they'll have lots of parties. And we're very proud. We work together as a team. So science is something that's done collectively, and it's one of the great joys of doing science is working together with people. In fact, yesterday I was talking to my students on a project. I have a bunch of different themes in my research group, and one of them recently is machine learning. And we saw a paper by somebody that we thought was wrong, and we're going to go after it. And so they sent me this last night. This is from, and I was very chuffed that they put me in there until I realized that the place where my face was is actually Darth Vader. So I'm not quite sure what they were trying to communicate there, but there I am, and there's my very brilliant students. And so my job is often, I go around speaking about my work, and it's the students that actually do all the work. And it's a great joy to work with people in this way. And so I have a kind of rule when I give these kind of talks, and I do a lot of these talks on science and faith, big questions, to always talk about a little bit of science, because I really think science is one of the most amazing things that humans have ever created. And so I want to talk about one little piece of science that I got interested in a number of years ago. And that is the question of self-assembly. How do things make themselves? And I'll give you just one really simple example, which is topical at the moment. Viruses. So what is a virus? A virus is just a little shell made of something called a protein with inside of it a little piece of DNA or RNA, some little coding molecule. And that's it. It's a little container carrying a little bit of a little code inside of it. And what it does is it goes into your cells, and there it uses the machinery of your cells to make copies of itself. And once it's made enough copies, it'll kill the cell, and then there'll be lots of it coming out, and it'll repeat. And this is why you might feel sick after a little while, or why it might spread around the world very quickly. But what's interesting about these viruses is, how are these little shells made? Well, it turns out these shells have all kinds of beautiful shapes. So here are two. This one right here is made of effectively 12 pentagons. And this one, if you count them, is 12 pentagons and 20 hexagons. Now, if you take an old-fashioned football, or soccer ball if you're an American, football, you look at how it's stitched. It's exactly stitched like this. 20 hexagons and 12 pentagons. So nature got there first, and it's a really cool kind of thing. Now, you could ask yourself, your cell takes these proteins, takes the DNA or RNA from the virus and makes lots of these proteins. How do these proteins then come into these little balls, right? There's no little factory in the cell that makes, like, ball-making factory, right? So they have to self-assemble. In other words, these little units, these 12 pentagons or the 12 pentagons and the hexagons, float around in your cell and make little balls that encapsulate little copies of the DNA. And they do hundreds or thousands of these in each of your cells before they cell bursts, and out they go. And so I got interested in this. I thought, wait, how does this work? How do these particles that just float around by themselves, how do they make these beautiful, perfectly shaped balls? And so I actually worked on this with one of my students, and this is a computer simulation of the self-assembly of a bunch of 12-mers. And what I wanted to show you is these 12-mers are all moving completely randomly. Okay, I put a whole bunch of these little pentagons in there, and these pentagons, they move around randomly, and they all come together into these perfect little 12-mers. And if I restart this simulation again and give it a different random seed, it'll form exactly the same shape again. Different units and different ones, but it'll self-assemble in the same way. By the way, I had to tell our computer guys that these were good viruses, not computer viruses. He was a bit nervous about them for a while. And so I think this is really amazing, right? I think we explained here something, we understood something about how these things make themselves. If you think about this a little bit more, then if I could solve this problem more generally, then I could do something like this. I could make Lego blocks that you put into, say, a box. You shake the box, because in your cell, these things are wiggling around by thermal motion. They shake them a little bit. And if I designed it right, it would spontaneously form a train. So we always asked, what are the applications of your research? And I sometimes like to say, well, maybe application would be in the toy industry. My children would absolutely love Legos like this. If you make Legos, you could shake it and it would come fully formed train. But nature does this all the time. So we'd love to understand how this works. And so one big theme in my research group is trying to understand this, and it's more from a mathematical point of view. I'm a professor of theoretical physics, which means I don't do any experiments because I tend to mess those up. And I fiddle around with pen and paper, a bit like our chair today, Martin Buzza, does. I should say that science is fun. It's really fun. In fact, I pinch myself that I get paid money to work on this. And I should say, those of your taxpayers, thank you very much, because it's your tax money that pays for me to work on these kinds of things. And you may wonder, and perhaps you're justified in wondering, why you're paying me money to think about how to make Legos that make themselves. But what happened about 10 years ago, I read about this, and I got interested in it, and I decided to stop what I was doing and start working on this. And that sounds very indulgent, I know, but a lot of our greatest discoveries have come from this kind of curiosity-driven research. Someone's curious, someone says, hey, what is that? And that's how many of our ideas come from. And we think that this may transform medicine, for example, may transform technology. And so I think these might have great applications, but I'm doing them also because they're really quite fun. And so I should say thank you. Hopefully I've made you less worried about where your tax money is going, but I'm very grateful to you. So I'll give you another example of something that I've been interested in for a little while, and that's the following question. So what makes us different? I grew up in Gabon in Central Africa. How many of you know where Gabon is? You should, if you're from Hull, because there's a great football player, Daniel Cousin, who played for Hull football team. But anyway, so in Gabon, my parents are biologists, and we had a chimpanzee called Bertje when I grew up. Just in case you can't see the difference, this is me, and this is a chimpanzee. Okay. My mother said we looked different, but we behaved remarkably similarly. Now, what's interesting is that I share 15% of my genes with E. coli, 25% with yeast, 50% with flies, 70% with frogs. And if you kiss a frog, it becomes a prince, and it's even more that you share. But I share 98% of my DNA, of my genes, actually, not quite my DNA, but my genes, my coding genes, with Bertje, my chimpanzee. And I feel like I'm more than 2% different. So the question is, how does that work? And I got interested in this problem for a while because it turns out that actually the number of genes we have doesn't correlate well with complexity. Rice has a lot more genes than you have, for example. And you may think, why is that? And the reason is because you shouldn't think about genes as kind of architectural blueprints, like a drawing of a building where everything is laid down. Instead, they're much more complicated than that. And I'll give you one example. So this is from a bacterium called E. coli, and each of these little dots is a gene, and each line is telling you that gene is actually a switch, turning something else on or off, depending on the direction of the line. And now you can suddenly think about something which is really fascinating. I could draw lots of different lines between those little dots. I can make almost factorial number of different lines I could create between them. And so a huge new complexity opens up. And of course, we're used to this in other contexts. In electronics, we have switches, and we connect them to each other, and we can make that into an oscillator or into an amplifier and all kinds of things. So we can take the same components and rearrange them and get something else. And so nature does the same thing. It uses these genes that turn things on and off as switches. That's why every cell in your body has exactly the same DNA, your eye cell and your liver cell. But in the eye cells, everything that's liver is turned off, thankfully, and everything's eye is turned on, and vice versa. And those are all little switches doing stuff. Now you may wonder, why is a physicist interested in this? Well, I'll show you. Because it's full of beautiful equations, okay? And we love equations. In fact, another nice thing, one of the things about being a physicist, besides getting paid to do stuff that you think is fun by taxpayers, sometimes when you're traveling and you're tired, or you need to read something, and you have that person next to you that keeps wanting to talk to you, and you don't want to be impolite. So I usually say, I like equations. And then if they keep asking me, I say, what's your favorite equation? And then if they don't like that, I might show them this one and say, what do you think about this equation? And then at that point, the conversation usually ends, and they leave me alone. So it's fascinating. We don't really understand, to be honest, how this logic of life really works. We can see that it changes all kinds of things, and so I'd love to understand that from a mathematical point of view. So science is amazing. Science has taught us, in fact, that these genes switch one another. It's taught us a lot about who we are, a lot about how we work. And so perhaps the question that I'm being asked today is something like this. Science has been so successful, won't they answer all the questions that we would like to ask it? So for example, I've got this little phone I carry in my pocket, and it's absolutely amazingly powerful. It has more power than the computers that took the first men to the moon. That's real, genuine advancement. We live longer than we used to. Right? That's real, genuine advancement. The whole question of what we do with it. So, if somebody comes from outer space and notices that humans have developed these things in their pockets, computers in their pockets, they'll be very impressed until they see that we mainly use them to look at cat videos. But be that as it may. So I'm going to ask this question: given that science has done all these great things, won't it be great if that same power of advancement that we see in technology or medicine or science could answer the really important questions, like what does it mean to be human, or what does it mean to live a good life? So I want to step back a little bit and talk about something in my childhood. So I showed you that picture of myself with a chimpanzee. So I grew up in Gabon in Central Africa in the jungle. And when I was 7, we went back to my native country, the Netherlands, for a year. And we lived in flats, which was a completely new concept for me. And I remember one day as a 7-year-old standing in front of the flats and being completely overwhelmed by the realization that behind every single one of those windows was another family whose life might be as complicated as my own. And you're 7-year-old, your life is very full with yourself mainly. And that was the point at which I realized that there were other people that had lives like that. You may wonder why it took me till I was 7, okay? But there you go. And then, of course, at school, I realized that the world was much bigger than just the flats that I lived in. There was a whole Earth that we lived in, which is part of a solar system, and we were just one of many planets spinning around a giant star called the Sun, which itself is part of this very big system called the Milky Way, with these spiral galaxy. And if you turn the Milky Way on its side, we are actually here on this spiral arm of the galaxy. And so suddenly we're not just one of many families living in a flat, but one of many stars in this giant galaxy with on the order of 100 million stars in it. And then you can zoom out a bit further. This picture is not a picture of stars, but a picture of galaxies. Every single one of those dots is a galaxy taken by the Hubble Deep Space Telescope. We think that there are on the order of 100 billion galaxies, each with about 100 billion stars. That's 10 to the 11 squared is 10 to the 22. Maybe it's even 10 to the 23 stars. That's an unimaginably large number of stars in the universe. So it's not hard to look at that and to ask ourselves, who are we? Right? That just seems unimaginably vast. And interestingly, that question that we get by looking at the universe and feeling small is not new. Many thousands of years ago, the Hebrew poets wrote in the Psalms, when I look at the stars, what is man that you are mindful of him? I think it's very natural. You look at the stars and you feel that something is amazing. And I think what our telescopes and our microscopes have done is they have just enhanced that feeling for us. not only is it the feeling of looking at the night sky and thinking, this is amazing, but you can now realize that's just a small, tiny fraction of what's out there, which is absolutely amazing. And this brings me to an even deeper question, I think, and one of the most deep questions that we could possibly ask, which is this question, why is there something in the first place? Not only why are there so many stars, why is there a universe, but why is there something? And I don't mean, why is there our universe? I mean, why are the laws of nature that we need for universes to pop into being? This is a very profound question. And I think there are really three answers to first order to this deep question. The question of why are there laws of nature that allow something like our universe to exist? One is, these laws of nature have always existed, so they're somehow eternal. So perhaps they've always existed, or some previous set of laws caused the current set of laws, and then you have an infinite set regress of causes. But something of that nature would be one of the options, so that they're somehow eternal, they've always existed. Something like the natural laws that we see, or some precedent has always existed. The second option would be that the laws of nature popped into being out of nothingness. So there was nothing, and the laws of nature popped into being. When I say nothing, I don't mean a vacuum, or a quantum vacuum, or something of that nature, which has been used in one or two popular books to confuse the issue, really. Nothingness means real nothingness, so no laws of logic, no laws of mathematics, no nothing, real nothingness, and the universe pops into being. Now, that's a true possibility, and that would be a second option that you would have for the universe, for the laws of nature existing. And the third option would be that all of space-time, so all the laws of nature that we see, is dependent on a non-spatio-temporal reality, a being who cannot not exist. So a necessary being would be the fancy word, the word that comes from Thomas Aquinas, for example. What we normally might think of God. So God would be outside of the laws of nature, by definition, the first cause or the primal cause. And the point of this exercise is not to argue for one or the other, although I'll happen to favor the third. The point of this is to say, doesn't matter whether you believe in something like God or not, these are roughly, to first order, your three choices. None of these three choices are in any way scientific. All three of them are philosophical choices. And the question really is not which of these is necessarily which is true today, but how would you adjudicate between these three choices? All of them are in some sense strange. And whether you believe in God or you don't believe in God, you have to take one of these options into account, and they're all strange. So I think it's really important to take that into account and to think about that. All right. So when we say science has been so successful, we want to answer all the big questions for us too. I hope I've shown you one, perhaps the biggest question. I think by definition, science can't answer it. It's a metaphysical question. It's a question about the nature of reality rather than a question that describes how nature itself works. And when I talk about these questions, science and faith, I want to explore a little bit more the idea of what can science tell us, what can it not tell us. But before I do that, I want to get rid of a few, what you may call zombie myths. Okay? I call them zombie myths because you chop at them, okay, and you think you've killed them and they rise again. And so this is the zombie myth. And I'll touch on them very, very briefly, and in the Q&A, we can talk about one or two of them more if they particularly interest you. I think that people like John Lennox or others will have covered some of these in more detail. The one of them is the conflict metaphor for the history of science and religion. And the conflict metaphor is something like this. In the past, we believed in fairies and goblins, and we were superstitious, and along came science and brave scientists who fought against this, and now we have reason. And so that if you believe in that kind of story of history, then you also have a story of a conflict between the brave scientists and typically the superstitious religious people. And so it's called the conflict metaphor. Well, interestingly, the conflict metaphor is a kind of dirty word among the guild of people who study the history of science, because it's patently not true, even though it's incredibly popular in the public sphere. And the reason for that is because the interaction between science and faith was much more close. A lot of science grew out of deep religious convictions. Many of the world's founding scientists, people like Newton and Boyle and others, were deeply religious, much more influenced by religion than the average people of their time. And So that is basically a myth. And my friends, believers and non-believers who are historians of science, really, really dislike this myth. And they say they keep fighting against it, but like a zombie, it keeps rising itself. And we're not really sure. The interesting question is not, were science and faith in conflict with each other, because they weren't. The interesting question is, why does the zombie myth keep arising? That's the interesting question. The other one might be that scientists today no longer believe in God. So in the past, when the culture was more ostensibly religious, people would say they believed in God, but now they don't. And that's an interesting question. It turns out that scientists have actually been, there's not been a huge change over the last 100 years in the fraction of scientists that believe in God. It's been much more stable than the general public has. But nevertheless, when I tell people that I believe in God, and I'm a card-carrying, normal Anglican Christian, take my faith very seriously, people look at me somewhat suspiciously, like, how can that be true? It's as if they think I'm a vegetarian butcher, somebody who doesn't really believe in what they do. So actually in Oxford, we have a course called Developing a Christian Mind, which is aimed at postgraduate students to help them think Christianly about their subjects. And there's about 100 plus Christian academics who are involved in this, teach on it in one way or the other. It's a wide range of disciplines. And interestingly, for us, in this course, which I help organize, it's really easy to get scientists to speak. In fact, my problem is I've got lots of scientists who want to speak, and I've got to kind of, give them, you can do this year, then you can do next year. Whereas actually in the social sciences and humanities, there's a much smaller fraction of people who take their faith very seriously. So in the academy, at least in the academy that I know, it's almost the opposite of what you might expect. I think we'd like to say for us, Christianity is intellectually robust. It's really important that Christianity is intellectually correct and robust, because intellectual life is very important, but it's also existentially satisfying to us. And many of the world's most famous scientists today are Christians. So I think in the book table, I just noticed the language of God is going to be, can you just get that to me? I just want to show it, because it's a friend, I see it on the top here. I see it. This is written, a very good book by a friend of mine, actually, Francis Collins, who runs the NIH, which is the American National Institute of Health, which has a budget of something like $30 billion a year. It's the world's most powerful, the world's biggest science funding agency, and he's a strong Christian. If you want to look in more detail at what scientists really believe, and actually another friend of mine, Elaine Howard-Eklund, a sociologist, has done the world's biggest study on this topic. Type her name into Google and you'll find lots that she's written on it. That's the second myth. The third myth, which I'll explore a bit more in detail, is that believing in God is like believing in a pink unicorn or a flying teapot. Flying teapot is from Bertrand Russell, who said, I don't need to believe in God like I don't need to believe in a flying teapot. And the pink unicorn is a more recent innovation by my colleague Richard Dawkins, who's a great writer. And he says this: if you want to believe in teapots, unicorns, tooth fairies, Thor, or Yahweh, the onus is on you to say why you believe in it. The onus is not on the rest of us to say why we do not. We who are atheists are also atheists, teapotists, and unicornists, but we don't have to bother to saying so. He's a great master of rhetoric. Now the question is that actually right? Is that the right way of thinking about this? Well, the kind of God that we think of, who is the source of all being, the reason for why we exist, is completely different from a being like ourselves who's just bigger and stronger and smarter. God is the reason why the universe exists. In traditional Christian theology, we say God sustains the universe, by which we mean if God were to stop sustaining the universe, it's not like it would slowly grind to a halt because God's not fiddling with it. It would simply no longer exist. Right? So we're looking at something much, much bigger than another object in the universe. If I come to you and say, I've discovered this new amazing virus in my laboratory that no one's ever seen before, then you're right to say the onus is on you, on me, to give you evidence for that. And you can be a new virusist until I find this virus. So it's a perfectly good way of doing a lot of aspects of life, but it's the wrong way to think about God. And we have to think a different way about God, right? Because God is the reason for why we exist. God is not some being out there that we can kind of poke in the way we would some kind of scientific object. That doesn't mean that we're therefore left to fall back on some kind of irrationality. Instead, I think we should think about it in a different way, and I'll suggest very briefly one way of thinking about this or adjudicating this. This is from John Polkinghorne. Sir John Polkinghorne, a very famous physicist and theologian in Cambridge, who said, if we are to understand the nature of reality, we have only two possible starting points. Either the brute fact of the physical world or the brute fact of a divine will and purpose behind that physical world. I'll unpack that for a minute. What does he mean? What John is saying is either there is a God, okay, and therefore that describes the way fundamentally, ontologically, the way the world is, or there is no God. But the choice we have is one of those two. And the way we adjudicate this is by taking that lens, one lens or the other lens, looking at the world and asking ourselves which of these two makes the most sense of the world. And for example, if I say I believe there is some kind of divine will and purpose behind the world, then it's very natural that, for example, if I do an experiment here in Hull, then if I do the experiment in the same conditions in Oxford, I should get the same result, at least if I'm good at my research. And the reason for that is because we believe that the laws of nature are uniform. They're the same here as they are over there. Now, you may think that's completely unremarkable. But in Gabon, the jungle where I grew up, people would find that very remarkable because our experience of nature is that nature is capricious. Nature doesn't feel very repeatable at all. And the history of science tells us that it was theologians thinking about the idea of a God who sustains the world, a God who is faithful. That's where the idea of something like uniformity or repeatability came up. And those ideas were what sparked the scientific revolution. Now, if I don't believe there is a God, then I can still observe that uniformity works well, but I have no kind of deep reason for believing it to be true. It just is another brute fact about the world. So on balance, uniformity, I think, is evidence in favor of there being a God. And you can play this game with lots of different questions about the world, and that's the way that you can adjudicate these kinds of big questions. It's not easy. I think science on balance points more towards the divine will and purpose behind the world. Perhaps when we look at something like suffering, it's much harder to see, and perhaps it feels more like a world which there is no good, no evil, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference seems a better explanation, or it might seem. And so we have to weigh those things off and see what we think is the best way of thinking about the world. But the important about the zombie myth is that if somebody says to you, I don't believe in God, just like I don't believe in goblins or fairies, that's just nonsense, okay? That's not proper thinking. Right? You've got to think about it in a much more careful way. All right. And then we come to the last question, which is the topic of today's lecture, which is science the best avenue to truth about ultimate questions? And so I'm just going to quote one of my scientific heroes, an atheist, Sir Peter Medawar, Nobel Prize winner in Oxford, who said the following: "Science is a great and glorious enterprise, the most successful, I argue, that human beings have ever engaged in. To reproach it for its inability to answer all the questions we should like to put to it is no more sensible than to reproach a railway locomotive for not flying, or in general not performing any other operation, for it was not designed." And so in this really lovely book he wrote just before he died, Sir Peter's pointing out that science is great, but it can't answer many of the important questions. I gave you one example, why is there something rather than nothing? Let me give you another example which is perhaps more down to earth. What if I ask you to measure the value of a human being? Where do humans get their value from? Now, I hope that everybody in this audience believes that humans have intrinsic value. They've got intrinsic rights, okay? They've got value that is independent of their color or their intellect or their wealth or their race or any other metric by which we measure people. But how would science adjudicate this? Well, I'll be facetious and say, well, I could go to a chemist and ask for the value for elements in your body, but surely somebody with gold fillings is not worth more than somebody without them. A physiologist could measure the size of your brain, a psychologist how smart you are, an anthropologist how the community values you, economists how much economic value you produce. I do worry that sometimes we are measured in this way, but that's not good, okay? Each of these different ways somehow feels impoverished. Right? And so the question then is, where do values come from? Science measuring things is not the right way of doing so. In fact, I think not only is it not the right way of doing so, it's actually dangerous. If people start telling you science can answer all questions, that means they're immediately down a slippery slope towards saying some people are more valuable than others because there's something about them that we can measure that's different. And so we need to get those values from somewhere else. In Christian thinking, we'd say human beings have intrinsic value because they are loved and created by God. Other traditions have other arguments for why humans have intrinsic value. You may just say, like my grandparents were very staunch humanists, and they would just say, we assume that humans have intrinsic value. We don't need anything else. It's just an assumption we make about the world, and we don't need to justify it. We just believe it. That's fine. That's better than not believing it. And I can ask another question, which is really important. Who am I? What am I? What is this thing walking in front of you? What does it mean for me to be a human being? Well, there's lots of ways of thinking about that. Here's one of the greatest scientists of the last century, Francis Crick, from Watson and Crick, The Structure of DNA, who wrote in a book, The Astonishing Hypothesis, your joys, your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than, and I put in a little word there called nothing but, and you'll see in a minute why, nothing but the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. Nothing buttery is something like saying you are nothing but, in this case, the assembly of a bunch of nerve cells. Now, is that really the best way of thinking about things? So it is true that we are a collection of chemicals. In fact, you and I are made of about 60% water. And Kieran, do you want to wave your hand? Kieran sitting in the back is Martin's son. Martin said I had permission to rib him a little bit. So Kieran, imagine one day, Kieran's a very good-looking chap, and some young lady sitting in front of a young lady who he's trying to impress a little bit. There's candles on the table, it's good. Rose on the table, very good. And at some point, the conversation gets more serious, and she turns to Kieran and says, Kieran, do you know who I really am? Kieran, budding scientist that he says, I know who you are. You're made of water. You've got enough iron for 2,000 matches. You're made of enough phosphorus for 2,000 matches, enough iron for one nail, enough chlorine to disinfect a swimming pool. And as he knows, the question, Kieran, is a dangerous one. You have to answer right. And so you scratch your head and you say, enough fat for 10 bars of soap. At which point, she will not be impressed, okay, as you can probably see. And so the question is, and the reason she's not impressed is because actually there's nothing about that that's not true, right? But that probably wasn't really what the question was about, right? There's something more to us than just the sum of the chemicals we're made of. And here's another way of thinking about that. Let's say I look at a pot of water, and it's boiling. So you come into my home, and the water's boiling on the stove, and you say to me, why is the water boiling? I say, oh, well, there's a thermal heat source that transfers energy across the container wall into the liquid. That increases the mean square velocity of the water molecules, which is directly proportional to temperature. When that temperature reaches 100 degrees Celsius, then there is a phase transition from a condensed phase to expanded phase, which we call boiling. And that's a perfectly good answer to that question, probably not what you're asking. I might also say, I fancy a cup of tea. Would you like some? Right? And the important point is that I haven't, by explaining the physics of it, I've not somehow devalued everything else. Right? And nothing buttery is when I take one of these explanations and say it's nothing but that. Right? It's nothing but the fact that I want to make a cup of tea. It's nothing but the transfer of thermal energy across the container wall. And listen carefully to people who wrap themselves in the mantle of science and tell you you're nothing but X, Y, or Z, you're nothing but the chemicals that you're made of. What they're doing is often a kind of nothing buttery. So back to this question of who am I? Well, I'm lots of different things, okay? I'm a self-assembled biological machine. I'm the product of my genes. I'm the product of an evolutionary process. I'm a member of a social system. I'm gendered. I'm a citizen. I'm an economic actor. I'm a father. Every single one of those things is true about me. If I picked one of them by themselves and said I'm nothing but that would be odd. In fact, I just want to point out I am an animal, from the kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, all the way down to species Homo sapiens. And that is absolutely true about me, but I'm not just an animal. Right? But it's very important that I'm an animal. That helps me a lot in understanding who I am. So all those things are true. And it's impoverished to think that only these scientific explanations explain everything about me. And as a Christian, to ask this question, who am I can have lots of other answers. And one of them that I think is important for me is that I am a child of God. I've been made by God, and that's why I have intrinsic value, which is independent of what I perform, or how I look, or how much money I make, or all those other kind of external metrics, because the value is intrinsic. So I come to near the end of my talk. The main point I wanted to tell you is that there are lots of these big questions. Why are we here? Who am I? What is the value of a human being? Why is there something rather than nothing? What does it mean to live a good life? And these are all questions which science cannot answer. Science can help us sharpen the questions, okay? It can help us maybe sometimes adjudicate some of the ways of thinking about the questions, but by its very nature, it cannot and will not ever be able to answer those questions. And if we think that it does, then we're fooling ourselves. We're wrapping ourselves in the mantle of science, or blinding ourselves by science, but importing some kind of other set of philosophical assumptions. We're all, in the end of the day, philosophers or theologians, whether we like it or not. We have ideas about what the good is, how we ought to live as a society, etc., which we get from somewhere. And the question for us is not whether that's true or not. I think that's unquestionably true. The question is, are our ideas about the good ideas? Right? Are our ideas about God good ideas? Have we thought about these things carefully? Have we tried to find the best way of answering those questions? Sometimes I think that science, when people say that science is the only way of answering questions, is the only way to get answers to these questions, are a little bit like the man who lost his keys on the street at night, and you find him looking around under the lamppost, and you ask them, where did you lose your keys? He says, I don't know where I lost my keys. Why are you only looking on the lamppost? He said, well, the light's better here. Okay? So science is a great and powerful light. It shines extremely strongly. Okay? But if we limit ourselves only to those things that it can do by its repeatable methods, then we have lost on something. The truth may be just a bit further out there, and we have to explore a bit further. And that's the main thing I want to leave with you, that big questions are not fundamentally answered by science, and that you might need to move a little bit outside of your comfort zone sometimes to look for where the big answers are. So thank you very much.